There's a movement brewing, and that movement is the Me Total lifestyle.
It centers around you keeping your sense of self intact and in gaining clarity of purpose as you age. I'm Carrie.
I'm Joe.
I'm JM.
And we're on a mission to show you how to enjoy friends, fellowship, and life without substance dependence.
It's time to discover how you can begin living a Me Total lifestyle.
Right here on the FUZZEE'ish podcast. Let's go. All right, FUZZEE'ish Nation. We just finished a pretty cool interview with Dr. Eddie O'Connor, sports psychologist. JM, Joe, what are some of the things our listeners can look out for with this episode?
Yeah, I mean, for me, just the alignment of what he talked about and just how crystal clearly it resonated specific to what we talk about with Me Total, particularly around the fact that there's no real way to get to that place except for, in his example, removing the emotion and staying focused on the purpose. Those are all things that we can, I'm going to put into action myself coming out of this conversation today, but also continue to reemphasize from the various positions and perspectives that we are on this show and in other places as a way to really achieve this Me Total life that we're so dead set on helping people to find.
Yeah, Dr. Eddie says some really interesting things in this episode, things that I don't know whether I don't, necessarily 100% align with everything, but I find it interesting nonetheless. Like you guys know me, I'm the eternal optimist. Everything that comes in one ear and out the other, it's usually filtered by some sort of how do I make this a positive thing? So the aspect and idea of, not forcing yourself into the positive, whether or not I believe it or not, it would be really hard for me to change who I am in that regard. Maybe I do. I don't know. I'm open-minded to that. So, I mean, I think it's just kind of like that. He has a lot of tips and tricks of the trade when he's helping these world-class athletes, Olympians, junior Olympians, really get it. Sleep. Everybody in the world tells you need more sleep. I get 4 hours a night. I'm a dad of 4 kids, and I've got a pretty, high functioning job, multiple different jobs as a consultant. It's really hard for me to figure out how to get 8 or 9 hours of sleep. Not that I shouldn't do it. I should probably figure out how to do it. I'm willing to try to go there, but it's really hard for me to look at some of the stuff he does and understand how it applies to my life. But nonetheless, I totally see how his world of sports psychology would work for some of these people that are, a quarterback or a swimmer or something like that. And he does show us how he maps some of those tools towards everyday life. One of the things I loved he talked about was, just goal setting and using vision and planning for your everyday life, and how he maps it to everything in life, everyone in life is performing at life. So take it for what you will, whether or not you want to agree with that or not, you're still putting on a performative experience for who you express yourself to the outside world. So these sports psychology tricks do actually apply to us in an everyday setting.
Yeah, I think you guys covered it all. I'll just tell our listeners, this is definitely one worth checking out. As Joe mentioned, just some of his thoughts around positivity and sleep science. I think just those two things alone are totally worth the listen. So yeah, tune into this episode. It's worth it. And we look forward to connecting with you guys on the other side. Hello, and welcome to the FUZZEE'ish podcast. I'm your host, Carrie, joined by my co-host, JM and Joe. How you doing, fellas? Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year to you. Good to see you.
Awesome. Hey.
All right, so our guest today, Dr. Eddie O'Connor, is a true advocate for intentional living. His tagline, "Overcoming Obstacles to Excellence," forms the foundation for his work and philosophy around peak performance and sports psychology. Not only is he a renowned professional speaker and clinical sports psychologist, but he's also reshaping the landscape of peak performance. His rich and varied experiences bring a unique perspective to sports psychology and the Me Total lifestyle, which we talk a lot about here on the FUZZEE'ish podcast. So Dr. Eddie, Happy New Year and a warm welcome to the FUZZEE'ish podcast. How are you?
Hey, man, I'm doing great. Thanks very much for having me. I'm excited to get started with you.
Yeah, we're glad you're here. We are glad you're here. So just to dive right in, Dr. Eddie, can you just briefly share your professional journey and just sort of what drew you to specialize in clinical and sports psychology? I was doing a little bit of research, and on your website, you mentioned, kind of this pivotal moment, during your youth, you were running track and just trying to break 2 minutes and 10 seconds in the 800. And I was a track athlete, so I understand that 1 second
That's
can make a
moving.
big difference. But
And that's moving. 2
that
minutes,
is
10
moving,
seconds.
yeah.
That's moving. Yeah.
Oh, that's an exaggeration.
I guess it depends on who you're talking to, but could you elaborate just a little bit more on that experience and how it's influenced your career path?
Yeah, absolutely. So going even earlier than that, like I always loved psychology. I remember being a kid and reading Mann's Freud, Analysis of Dreams for fun. So I was kind of nerding out early on. I'd always wanted to do that. Went to college and so what happened with me personally is I was a runner and I was very much an athletic identity. Like I was all about running. But again, as I had said, I was like, I never really won. I was like sort of the best of the worst of the best, like right middle of the pack. But my athletic identity as a runner, like I ran cross country, indoor, outdoor, ran all summer, 4 years. That's who I was. And so when I was running, trying to break 210, like you said, those magic numbers, I kept running 211, junior year, senior year. And I had to analyze it later on after I went to graduate school. But what happened was as I was coming across the finish line, I wasn't tired, first of all. So I'd run a 211, wasn't tired. And then I'd go up under the bleachers and throw up as if I was exhausted. And you've had those workouts, right? And I've had a couple of those. But I was like, what's going on? I thought I was weird, but I couldn't do anything about it. Well, it turns out that I analyzed later on that, and a lot of my athletes have this issue too, that the idea of not achieving my goal had me subconsciously not run as hard as I could, because then I had kept hope alive. What I mean is that every time I came across, I had a reason or excuse for failing. I didn't really fail. I could have done it. I'll just do it next time. And it was this psychological, again, completely unconscious and completely not helpful, but emotionally it prevented me from ultimately settling in to the idea that I wasn't going to hit my goal. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that it prevented me from hitting the goal. Although my last race, I ran a 2:09. I think the article got that too. But I'm wondering, could I have done 2:05? Could I have broken 2 minutes? Given my training, I'm wondering that I probably could have. But it was this mental block that got me fascinated about why did I do that? And I didn't even know that I was doing it. How powerful are these thoughts? So I went to college for psychology, and I always just loved that idea of it, knew I wanted to be a psychologist. And then it was the last class I took that was called sports psychology, and I never heard of it. And I was like, what is this? This sounds fascinating. And I immediately fell in love and said, this is what I want to do. Because I had no idea that there was a psychology beyond pathology. I knew I wanted to help people whether they were depressed or anxious or sexual abuse or this or that. I was really kind of unclear as to where I wanted to specialize. But then once I saw this class and I realized that your thoughts and feelings affect the way that you perform, I immediately said, well, this is what I want to do. So I went and I got my PhD in clinical psychology, but I specialized in what athletes suffer from the most. So I've got the most experience in injury and rehabilitation, performance anxiety, imposter syndrome, perfectionism. I really specialize in that. And I work with athletes across the spectrum that if they're not doing well and they're in a slump, I can take them from that quote unquote pathology or that difficulty that they're having and bring them back to normal. But then even for the athlete that's doing normal and is fine but wants to be excellent, now I've also got the training and the experience to help them take it to the next level, because champions, if you want to be in the top 1%, you can't do what 99% of the other people are doing. You have to be abnormal. And there's a science to that. So I mean, it goes back and forth.
Performance anxiety, that word is tripping me up. It's such an interesting word. And, I'm all of us are sports fans to some extent. I saw that you're a Buffalo Bills fan, or at least I saw a Buffalo Bills helmet on your backdrop. What's going on with Josh Allen? Are they going to pull it together one of these days from a performance anxiety perspective and bring home a chip to Buffalo?
Yeah, I've gotten into my car and yelled at in Instagram a few times and saying, Josh, call me. What's going on? The last one that I had done, actually, I remember, I think it was against Denver. And I was like, please call me, because there is a reason that you're throwing these interceptions. There is something, feeling or thought that shows up that you're not paying attention to, and you're just impulsively going back to old patterns. Now, I can't analyze them from a distance. I don't know. I have full belief that we're going to win the Super Bowl this year, although I say that every year. But I really don't think there is necessarily anything wrong. Josh really does a fantastic job, again, looking from the outside. And I honestly say I see how much luck is really involved with the NFL and these other sports. Like one call goes a different way, or if it's so hard to demand that perfection. So as fans, I'm becoming more sensitive to be less critical of what I see on TV and understand what's going through. It's not always problematic. Gosh, how do I put it? It's like, again, without knowing it, I'm like staring at my Buffalo Bills flag here right now. So hard to get out of my fandom aspect of it. I'm going to put it this way. Like, I believe that they can do it and I believe they will, but I think that everything has to go right, no matter who wins it.
That's true.
I think that if they play any of these games over and over again, they'll win some and they'll lose some. And that's what makes sports so great. I haven't seen, I'll say this in their defense, I haven't seen them being out of their heads or out of their minds. I'll go back to when we lost the 4 Super Bowls. That's what I really wondered. Like when we were going against the Dallas Cowboys back in the early 90s, which I totally think those Bills teams could have beaten them. I was wondering how much the haunting of the 2 previous Super Bowl failures maybe interfered with their thinking. Again, I don't know if it did or didn't, but I know that for most of my athletes, those are things that would pop up and distract them.
Interesting. Well, we did one of those to you. Me and JM. I'm not sure about Carrie, but me and JM are lifelong Washington football team fans, which is kind of depressing in today's day and age. But yeah, we grew up in the suburbs of DC, so we watched Mark Rippon, I think it was, take us to a victory
Mark
over
Rippon.
you guys. Yeah,
and I will say that was the one of the 4 Super Bowl losses. That was the one that I was like, I really did think Washington was maybe the better team that year. That was an outstanding. The Hogs. Like, it was a great team.
It was such a tough one going. I've watched the recap of that season over so many times. Like, we were the unsexy choice, and Buffalo had all the glitz and glamour. Thurman Thomas, you had Bruce Smith, you got Jim Kelly. Like, I thought they were going to win. You know, I was very nervous. I was 12, but I was very nervous going into that Super Bowl. But good memories back then when we were actually decent.
I think the thing that you said about the referees, though, is so important, especially in that game. I mean, one flag going one way, especially when it's somebody's decision, is a big part of how those games get won and lost. So,
well, yeah, I live in Grand Rapids now, so the big talk about the Lions right now, and
that's crazy.
Reporting that they could be the number 1 seed depending how this weekend goes. But that's where we say, and we will remember these teams and these legacies completely different as a result of these calls.
Yeah. So Dr. Eddie, just I'm a 49ers fan. I kind of watch football from the sidelines, but I appreciate, what you guys are saying about the Buffalo Bills. To just double click on this concept of peak performance. I think a lot of people may think it's one thing, others think it's another, but I feel like positive thinking sort of gets put into peak performance. If you're trying to get out of your comfort zone, you have to kind of will yourself, you have to think yourself positively into it. And it sounds like you have kind of a different perspective on that. Could you talk a little bit about just sort of your thoughts on positive thinking? Is it helpful? Is it a placebo? Would you mind just diving into that a little bit more?
Thanks, Carrie. I would love to, because I'm going to go counter to what everybody else has heard. I'll start off by saying, like, I've pushed against positive thinking too much, and I think I've done it a disservice. So I want to clarify that I'm not against positive thinking, and I do believe in it when it works. And that's really the critical question. And I think as we talk today, we're going to talk a lot about this magical question of doing what works, more so than doing what's right or wrong, positive or negative. And what I mean by that is, if you can really tap into a thought that's more positive, more optimistic, and it fuels your motivation, why wouldn't you do it? Of course you would. And when we have those thoughts, we tend to do our best, and it's easier, and we're motivated. So I'm not against it. But I've a career here of athletes and other high performers, musicians, businessmen and women who come in, and they're like, well, I can't be positive right now. Like, how are we supposed to be positive in the middle of a career-ending injury? How are we supposed to be positive when it's the 4th quarter and we're down by 3 touchdowns and we still want to perform our best? How are we supposed to be positive when we've just made this traumatic mistake that's affected our families? Are we really supposed to just look at the positive side of it? That doesn't even feel realistic, let alone feel right to do. The reality is that there's negativity in our world all over the place. There's real adversity, real challenges, real consequences. And if we are expecting to be positive in these situations, we're going to have such conflict inside of ourselves, fighting what actually is. If I'm trying to be happy when I'm sad, I don't have the time, the attentional ability to be able to actually focus on the game if I'm fighting my emotions. You can't do 2 things at once. So what I teach my clients is this idea of, how do you learn to make peace with all of these negative emotions? Guys, let me ask you real quick. We have 4 basic human emotions. Can you guess what they are?
Happiness, sadness,
Fear,
Think Incredible Hulk.
strength, anger.
Anger.
Yeah.
Happy, sad, mad, and scared. How many of those are positive?
One.
One. So let's pause there, everybody who's listening.
Hmm.
Am I, as a sports psychologist, supposed to tell my athletes to perform in 25% of the emotions of what it means to be human? Like, are we always supposed to be positive when you're in a sport and somebody's going to lose and somebody's trying to kill you and mistakes are going to be made? You're just supposed to operate in this one thing of happiness. We've got, if we talked about culture earlier and the things that, are distorting things for us. Like, we've got this, the pursuit of happiness. Everybody deserves to be happy. And like, this is the goal. Happiness really should just be sort of a side effect of the meaningful stuff that you're doing. Anger has a purpose. Like, there's plenty of things for us to be angry about in our society. Are you supposed to not be pissed off about all the craziness and all the horrible things that are going on? Of course not. When people are anxious, what do we always tell them? Oh, relax and everything will be okay. But we know things aren't always okay. Like, am I supposed to believe that? And when I'm sad, everybody comes up and they don't like to see me sad. They come in, they try to cheer me up. But I'll never forget when my parents died. My uncle came up and hugged me and I was crying and he's like, oh, don't cry. They're in a better place. Was that supposed to make me feel better? I'm not crying for them. In fact, I believe that they were. Like, can't we have a tolerance and a respect for there's a time for grief? So I'm very much against this idea when we over push the positive thinking. And because it's not realistic. My champions, what we do is we're able to settle in and say, let's respect what you're feeling. All my performance anxiety, going back there, Joey, like when I have athletes that come in with performance anxiety, my first session is justifying why they should be anxious. You are going to disappoint your teammates if you mess up. Failures do cost you the game. That mistake is going to be a problem. Your coach is going to be pissed off. Am I supposed to tell you don't worry about it? I think you should worry about it. Now let's refocus on the reality of that situation and focus on what you need to do in order to prevent that from happening. How do we respect these negative emotions, embrace them for what they are, but then respond to them in a way that enhances our performance? So Carrie, thank you for that introduction. That is like the foundation of everything I do.
It's powerful, Dr. Eddie. Thank you.
I've heard a couple things in that make me think about some of the other stuff that I've been, researching over the past 6 months. Namely, I would assume anxious is a subset of fear, right? And then one thing that I've also seen both written in psychological journals, but also written in scriptures, is that there's no room in your brain to comprehend both anxiety and gratitude at the same time. So is there any merit to that from a sports psychologist standpoint? Like, is a tool of the trade to push out some of this negative thinking or, this fearful thinking, this anxious thinking, is when you're ready, when you've dealt with it and you're ready to put it in the past, is pushing gratitude in, and maybe even being thankful for the lessons you're learning. It doesn't have to be overly positive, but being thankful for even being alive. Like, is that a way to kind of grapple with some of these things?
Yeah, and I like the way that you had phrased it because it's really more of a paradigm shift. Like, I like to say that there's room for all of this. How do you interact with it is really the choice. So rather than having right and wrong thinking, things that you should do and stuff that you want to push out, look, we don't control what pops into our head. About 50% of our thoughts are automatic. I mean, just think about it. Like, if we were all going to be dialed in, you and I, all four of us, we would only be thinking about what each other was saying. But many things have popped in. I know I got thirsty, so I started to think about the water. I was going to drink. You might think about the next question. There might be a sound. Like, our heads, we have to respect that they wander. We also have a brain that the survival mechanism of our brain is to actually look out into the world and look for danger. So turtles, like, I have this little prop here. I use this with my clients. My son made this many years ago. But when you scare a turtle, it goes into its shell. When you scare a porcupine, its quills are going to come up. And when you kick a skunk, it's going to spray you. So it's got a survival instinct. And what we have as human beings is a brain that looks out to see what could go wrong as an opportunity to protect us. So there's your negative thinking. And the more you care about something, the more you're going to worry about it. So no, I absolutely don't, to answer your question, Joey, I don't tell people to push out anxiety. Because if you're going to push it out and you're going to try not to worry about it, it's going to make you more anxious because your brain's like, you're not following, your survival instinct. You're not paying attention to the threat, which is actually putting you at a greater risk. So I have people lean into whatever the thoughts are and then look at them from a functioning standpoint. Hey, why can I understand why my head might be thinking this? And then is it working or isn't it? So there are times if a student, for example, is worried about, not doing well on a test, and I said this to all my kids as they were growing up, I'm like, well, have you studied? Do you know it all? No. I'm like, well, then you should be anxious. I'm not going to defend your anxiety. Go downstairs and study. And they didn't like that response because they didn't like how they felt. But I'm like, you should feel uncomfortable. I am not going to treat your anxiety. Now, again, I'm not saying this as if you have panic disorders or obsessive compulsive disorder. I don't mean to branch it out into the extremes, but let's talk about like the everyday experience of it. So this idea of gratitude. We do know that when we adopt gratitude, it works for us. I don't know anybody that's ever adopted gratitude as a focus or an intentional practice that didn't benefit. So I don't want to say that that's the right thing to do or that you have to, but if it ends up being functioning. Now, if you choose gratitude in a place where, well, I don't know if gratitude is a good example. Let me say this, if I was negative and positive thinking. I was in the gym a couple of weeks ago, and I was just beating myself up, calling myself names, telling them, I won't curse on here, but I was pretty colorful. And somebody comes up to me, they're like, well, sports psychologist, what happened to all the positive thinking? And this is like, would you want a coach yelling at you? Or would you want a coach yelling at your son like this? I was like, well, first of all, I'm saying all this stuff with loving kindness. Like I'm beating myself up with a kind heart, but I'm saying it because I know I got more and I'm jacking myself up. Then I hit a PR. Like it worked. So being negative, calling myself names, people say, oh, that's bad, you shouldn't do it. It worked, therefore we could do it. And we see it in the other direction. If I'm in there and I'm like, I'm the greatest guy ever, I'm doing really well, I'm awesome, and it's taking the edge off and my performance is suffering because I'm not really, we see this in sports all the time, how there's an upset win because people are overconfident. Well, then all the positive thinking doesn't work. You shouldn't do it. Long-winded, sorry for the rattle, but I hope you're tracking here. The idea is, Joey, I really don't want your listeners to think that there's a certain way they have to think and force it.
Sure. Yeah.
I want you to step back and say, when I think these thoughts, is it moving me towards or away from where I want to go? That is so much more important. So much more important than whether even if it's true or not. What's the function?
Quick follow-up real quick, because you just unlocked something in my brain, and then I'll pass the mic over. But I mean, I love what you're talking about right now with the PRs, and I know JM can empathize with that as well. He's sending me his PRs on his Peloton like every other day. But when you said getting you closer or farther away from that's one of the biggest mantras that I've got in my life. Usually when I talk to anybody, it's what are you planning for, right? What are your long-term, intermediate, and short-term goals? And if you plan far out enough and you're specific and big enough with your goal setting, it makes it a lot easier in the short term to determine whether or not your daily decisions get you closer or farther away from your goals. So how much does, like, from a psychologist perspective, when you're dealing with high performing athletes or executives and stuff like that, how does setting that vision for your career, how much does that matter to what's going to go on in your daily life?
Yeah, it's absolutely foundational. So in my Success Stories community, this is something that we do, sort of a foundational practice. And I would even go beyond not only just the high achievers, but I would say if you're going to live like just your best life, even if you're just an average Joe, you have to kind of know what that's going to look like. And it might be from a goal setting standpoint of what are the things that I want to accomplish, but sometimes it's even a matter of like, who do I want to be? What's my character? Do I want to live a life of honesty or of hard work or of grace and compassion? And so with my athletes, when they come in, I usually try to help kind of uncover, and sometimes people don't know it, they can't label it, but once you kind of have a clear direction of the kind of character and life that you want to live, then you have a way to kind of reference and say, well, is every behavior, it's either going to move me towards or away from it. And it's not to force you into anything, because ultimately, if you at least can identify who it is that you want to be at your core, now it becomes your choice. And so your motivation comes out of it. If you're taking this because you should, or because some doctor told you to do it, or you're doing it for your parents, that stuff doesn't last. But when you can uncover and say who it is that I want to be, what's the kind of life that I want to live, what kind of impact do I want to make, that is by far the greatest motivator. And when adversity shows up, you have to have a clear picture of it, because that's going to be the fuel that gets you through. And then you get to hold each behavior up to it and say, it's either towards or away. Nothing is neutral.
Yeah, it's interesting. I subscribe to a lot of that, especially the things about purpose. I think people talk about wealth and success and health and impact and all those things. And at the end of the day, finding our own identity is what I think drives most of us. And all the things that you talked about, I certainly can speak about that for myself. So that's really interesting, the way that you framed that. And I'm interested. This is a theme we've been talking about a bunch on the show, specific to what really does motivate somebody to show up the next day to continue to work towards whatever purpose or identity or objective they have, both specific to personal and professional aspects of their life. And it sounds like you have a great story and a great model, but there's lots of great stories and great models. There's lots of different ways to think about it. Are you a subscriber of finding the right model and trying to stick to it to sort of drive yourself, or is being able to sort of put your tentacles out and feel the movement from each of these different types of directions, both products and practices to some degree, to find that willpower on a daily basis for ourselves and kind of centering back to our me total concept? What would you say to somebody that's sort of just having a hard time finding the path to showing up every day towards that will to win?
Yeah, great question. You know, what the research has been showing very recently, and I just presented it at our Sports Psych conference on this, got a really positive response to it, is that if you start to look at sort of what's the right thing to do, we started to discover there's been something wrong. I'm going to geek out for you here in a moment, but there's been something wrong with all the research that we've been doing, because as you take, 1,000 people and you get the average and you say, okay, here's the answer. No one person is that average person. So we get these protocols. Like one example, as a colleague of mine shared, is that, we all think that self-compassion is something that should be good, right? There's been lots of publications on it. Be kind to yourself. It can really help with performance as well as depression, anxiety. Absolutely. Well, research shows it works for about 3 out of 5 people. So, okay, good. It works for most. So should we do that for everybody? Well, if it works for 3 out of 5 people, what about that 4th person? Well, it doesn't really have an impact. It's kind of neutral. And then what about the 5th person? Well, it actually hurts 1 out of 5. And that, what's the reason for that? Well, then maybe they had a history where, if you're talking about being kind, maybe that triggers some type of childhood abuse memory, or, there's some association, but there's something that for whatever reason, it's not working. So are we supposed to go in and just meet people and say, here's the path, everybody, let's teach everybody 100% you should be doing self-compassion exercises? Absolutely not. That's irresponsible. So when I have clients come in, we got to see the individual at first. We have a literature about what tends to work. It's the same thing, like with whether it be exercise or nutrition, I'm finding. It's like we don't have any one plan for everybody. And we like it psychologically. It'd be a hell of a lot easier if we could just find out what's the plan, tell me and I'll do it. But you're an individual. You have your own history, your own thoughts, your own values, your own feelings, and nobody else has been created like you before. So hold on to everything lightly and take it. But if you're struggling, I ask you that you embrace that struggle and respect that you're an individual. That maybe you're trying to force some things that work for everybody else, but maybe it shouldn't work for you. The second big question is, if you're struggling, is to really lean into it. And rather than jump to like, I'm broken, there's something wrong with me, I'm lacking motivation, and this is problematic. What I have found is that we're all motivated to do something that helps us. Like, even take alcohol, right? Like, most people who are drinking, even if their life is falling apart, they're getting something out of it in the short term, often self-medication, for example. It helps me in the moment. Now, we're not saying that that's, of course, the right way to do it, but to kind of go in and just say that it's just bad and that's it, and that you need to respect that it's bad, never has gotten anybody to quit or to be more temperate.
Right.
We have to lean in and acknowledge that when I'm drunk, I don't feel anything. And that works for those 2 hours. And then we step back and say, okay, now can you get outside of yourself and look at the longer perspective? What happens after that? Well, then I feel guilty, and I'm absent from my kids, and I'm mean to my wife, and it's costing me too much money. And, you have all these other consequences, not to force you to feel any different, because you're still going to want to maybe lean in and do that thing that's not good for us, whatever it is. But if you can kind of come back and start to look at, how's it working overall? And when I have the urges to maybe drink or do that thing or eat that food when I want to be on a diet, whatever it is that's not working, and I can't figure it out, can we jump back and kind of look at the conflict? And this is where the values come back in. Because ultimately, if I can really hold on to who I want to be, then I can be willing to feel those unpleasant feelings in service of becoming that. And that's when we become successful.
Carrie and I were talking about this in between a couple of other calls this morning, and finding the will to show up for the person that we want to be is so important for all of this, right? And the reality is, to your point, it's not some specific described solution. And we say all the time on this show, there's not a 1 and 0 answer for any type of consumption or any type of mental wellness. The story is different for all of us.
Yeah.
And our mandate on this show is to help people to navigate a path to a place where they can understand that they have the support to find the better path that ultimately drives them towards that will to continue towards the identity and the purpose that you mentioned. So, can we sign this guy up as the doctor of me total? Because a lot of his
correspondent.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of what he's talking about is the center of how we think about it as much less educated and certainly less practiced experts in this space. So just fascinating.
Yeah,
stuff.
I love it. We talked about on the show once upon a time, I don't know, 10 episodes ago or something like that, where 7% of the population actually gets energy from drinking alcohol and doesn't get drunk hardly at all. They can drink like 10 drinks and not get drunk and actually have more energy. So 7% is not a percentage of the population to sneeze at. It's a decent amount of people out there. It's not representative of the average, certainly, but I think that maps back quite nicely to what you're saying, like 60%. 20% there's no effect, and another 20% it's a supremely negative effect. The same could probably be applied to alcohol consumption. For most people it's probably a net negative. For some people it's neutral, and then for a tiny fraction of people it's actually good, or it can be perceived as a better outcome than most people.
Yeah, and you know what? Well, one, I'm glad that we've got the synergy going on. So yeah, like, I give you academic endorsement of everything you're saying, and all the listeners listen to these guys because if this is brilliant stuff. And if you've used the word will a lot, I'd like to maybe elaborate on that, maybe tweak it for your audience a little bit. Is that the willpower is great when we try to force ourselves to do it. That's strength. As men, we like to do that, right? Like be strong, and it can be really challenging at times. Our willpower will break down. I would extend it and say, can you find the willingness? The willingness. Because let's go to your Peloton example, right? I imagine you're tired when you're on that thing, at least at some point.
I have 3 young kids too. So yeah, I'm tired all the time.
Yeah. And so for my athletes, it's something that they know that sport is hard and practice is hard and games are hard. And that's the difference between athletes and non-athletes. Like they're athletes because they're willing to hurt in service of the game. And non-athletes aren't. I remember when I was running, people were like, why do you do that? Just run around in a circle? And I'm like, I don't know. I can't explain it. But they're like, oh, but doesn't it hurt? Aren't you bored? Or this? It's like, no, that's part of the experience. And where we get stuck is that as human beings, we don't like hard things. We approach pleasure and we avoid pain, and we're all wired that way. Again, you're not broken if you struggle with that. So when you can find the meaning in it and develop the willingness and really come to terms to feel the discomfort, the pain, the frustration of whatever it is that you're in, and not have to escape to alcohol or to other types of things to make yourself feel better, that's where you're going to find the power. And it's not a strength in that sense of forcing it. Anytime we get a conflict and fighting ourselves, it's exhausting. It's a matter of saying, hey, I'm willing to embrace that pain. And I drop that struggle so all my energy can actually go into the behavior of doing whatever it is that I want to do. So willpower is great. Keep up the will. But if that's starting, just switch it over to willingness. And I think it'll give you the extra mile.
When you talk to shift. Oh, go ahead, Gary. Sorry, man.
No, go ahead, man. I was
just gonna. Yeah, when you said the one thing about the running and that you couldn't really explain it, we hear that a lot now with people that have been able to conquer drinking or other mental wellness issues in their lives and are now on a better path. And people say to them, well, what is it that you're feeling? And they have no way to really describe it. We even recently heard one of the bigger motivational people, David Goggins, was on a podcast, and he said, I don't get on shows and talk about this because I don't have a way to explain the feeling. But then when people feel it, they come back to me and say, I get it. Dr. Eddie, do you have a way to explain this feeling? Is there a mantra, so that's where we feel like me total is that feeling because it really cascades across all of these different aspects and different places that these sorts of things poke their head. So I'm just interested in sort of what you've described or defined that feeling as, going back to as an athlete through obviously all your practices now as well with the various people that you treat.
Yeah, it's if I'm understanding correctly, you might be surprised at this answer, but it's actually, I think the shift is to care less about our feelings. Because I'll go back to a kid example. Like, but why'd you hit your brother? Right? You see your kids. Well, he made me mad. Like as a kid, we just justify, oh, I felt this way, so then I did it. Well, if you do that when you're an adult, you go to jail, right? So we realize that while we're younger and we do things, and actually as adults, we do this all the time too. Well, why did you do that? Well, I was mad. I was anxious. I was this. And we use our feelings to justify our behaviors all the time. It's incredibly dangerous. Like if we just acted on how we felt all the time, we would all be dead or in jail by now, like decades ago. And so much of culture is still prioritizing the way that we feel. And I understand it's important. Of course I do. But it cannot be our guide in life. We can use the information. If I'm unhappy in a particular situation, I want to tune into the unhappiness and see what I can do about it. But I can't let my unhappiness be the determinant of how I act and treat other people or my work ethic. So I guess to answer your question in a different way, I would say that the feeling that it's captured it is really the detachment from feelings. The idea that my character is going to be what's most important, this principle that I want, and I'm going to let the feelings come and go as they are. I'm going to respect them and I'm going to lean into them, but I will not let them dictate my behaviors. And I will be aware of when I am acting impulsively in just an automatic response to the way that I feel. And if you can kind of dive into that, I don't know Goggins personally, but I know his feelings didn't dictate him. He decided he wanted to do something and like, it didn't matter how much pain he had or anything else. And that's how I guess I would describe it, you know, and, you know, the feelings will still come. This isn't going to make you cold hearted. You might actually find that, you know, you'll be more loving actually. Like when you can actually be intentional and treat your loved ones in a way that actually reflects the value of love as opposed to just the emotion of it. Now you'll find that, you know, great things will be enhanced. You'll have more joy in your life because you're living more intentionally. You're going to have greater intimacy. You're going to have greater health and productivity. And then you're going to have greater confidence. So I'm not against emotions, but I'm just kind of saying they're all things that should be flowing out of what you're doing. So in summary, I would deprioritize emotions overall, let them kind of come and go, and prioritize your intentional actions based on your values.
Sounds like everybody just needs to go to a comedy show and not take ourselves so seriously.
Well, there's a time for that too. Yeah, like that.
Definitely a time and a place. You're sharing a lot of wisdom here, Dr. Eddie. It would be a disservice to our audience if we didn't just speak a little bit. We know you have a podcast. We also know that you wrote a book. You also have courses, The Psychology of Performance, How to Be Your Best in Life. Would you be open to just talking about just some of the fundamental principles or strategies that you discuss in the book that, you know, our listeners may be able to just sort of implement right away and just kind of make some changes in their life?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book, it's an audio book. It's also a video downloadable through the great courses. It's called Psychology of Performance, How to Be Your Best in Life. And what I was really excited about when they invited me to do this was that they wanted to take sports psychology, but make it academic and practical so that anybody could use it. And they did a wonderful job of helping me translate. So some of the reviews on the course, it's 24 lectures, half-hour each, across every topic in sports psychology. So everything that we've talked about is in there. The idea of willingness, we do mindfulness, we talk about goal setting, we talk about some big issues in sport like injury. I have a chapter on sport parenting, the aging athlete for us masters athletes out there. So there's chapters on all of it. And it's all about sort of, here's the science, this is what it says, and then here's how to apply it. But I've had musicians and just everyday people kind of say, wow, this is great because it applies to sport, but these principles also apply to my everyday life. And that's the approach that I've taken as I go into the other thing that I really want to talk about would be the success stories community that I have. So I don't have a podcast. I don't know, maybe this is what you'll be thinking, but the success stories community is actually an online platform where there's individual coaching from me, but everything that I teach, I've also got into these online modules. So people can work through all of these principles to develop this, what we call psychological flexibility, this ability to learn how to be present in the moment, to learn how to detach from those thoughts and feelings as we've discussed, so that you can have clarity of your values and take committed action towards that. So I've got a lot of athletes in there. I've got young athletes, I've got world champions, I've got masters level athletes, but then again, I've got everyday people who are trying to live their best lives, be their best selves in music or in family. So it's a community that it's opened up, and you get to work with others as part of a support system. Again, there's all the training, there's individual coaching with me. And I've loved that community because it's been so hard to change the world one person at a time. And that's why I'm on your podcast and stuff like that. I love to kind of put this stuff out there because some of it is different. A lot of it is different than what you're hearing. And it gets me honestly pissed off that we're talking about all this positive stuff and forcing people, making them feel broken. There are challenges and there's information that you can learn. And if you want one of the nuggets, as you said about some of the things to share in there, two big ones. One is get more sleep. And if you're like, oh, I get enough, I'm talking to you because none of us are getting enough sleep, almost none of us. And if you're getting your 9 hours, then okay, you can stop listening. But most people out there are, as I know, like 6 hours, 7 hours, if not less than that. And simply that's not enough. The science is very powerful about how much that ends up hurting our mood, our personality, our productivity, and all the stuff that I'd be teaching here. Like when I have athletes come in, if they're getting less than 6 hours, I do no mental training with them until I'm getting them up to 8. And the reason for that is that your brain's not going to be able to do all the things that I'm teaching you. You just can't unless you're getting that brain refreshed. So I could spend a whole other podcast on sleep, but I promise you, and this has been everything from my clinical clients to my professional athletes. When I'm getting them to sleep more, their performance is improving. And the other one is a focus strategy. Real simple, but I say this to myself 100 times a day. What's important now? If you want to win, W-I-N, you want to bring your attention to what's important now. So much of our mind is racing into the future and the what if thinking or stuck in the past. But if you find yourself lost in your overthinking, if you ask yourself what's important now, you'll bring yourself into the present moment, into the thing right in front of you. And the answer to that is where you can guide your attention. And when you practice that, again, you'll find less distress and anxiety, but greater productivity with that simple focusing strategy.
Wow, that's pretty important. And for the listeners out there, I don't know if you guys were doing the math in your head like I was. You could binge watch all of this stuff on the great courses in about 12 hours. So similar to Netflix, just, clear your calendars this weekend, pop on, go over to great courses, sign up for the programming, 12 hours, you're in and out, and you've learned a ton from Dr. Eddie. So that's awesome.
So Dr. Eddie, on the sleep part, because we've heard sleep in a bunch of places, I read about sleep. Yeah. I try to focus really hard on schedule and sleep. It's really hard to find a clear answer on how much sleep you need as a human. It's very, different people have different perspectives, but all say that sleep matters. What say you?
Yeah. So let me jump in. I'm laughing, if you can see already, as soon as you said it, because again, I've got a lot of pet peeves. And that's one of the questions I ask, well, how much do I need? Okay, well, let me ask you, how much water do you need to live?
Right.
How much food do you need to survive?
I know.
Like that's the attitude we take with sleep. What's the bare minimum I can do to get by? That is not a performance enhancing attitude. What I want my athletes to think about is how much sleep can I get to maximize my performance? And we're not going to get a prescription. Everybody is different. I know for me, like I do much better with 9 versus 8. And I knew that ever since I was a kid. And so, some people might be better. People are like, well, I do fine with 6. I do fine with 7. I'm like, I'm sure you do. But I'm telling you that the literature has shown that there's performance enhancing effects. So I'm not telling you that you have to do it. Again, I'm not here to force you to do anything. But if you were my client, I'd say, okay, well, how much better do you want to be? The Olympians, they're saying, well, I want to be the best in the world. So they're sleeping 10, 11 hours and they're, going to bed at the same time every night and they're, room darkening shades and they're not drinking caffeine late and they're not on their phones. Like you're right, JM. Like it's hard.
Yeah.
That's the other big barrier. People say, oh, but it's hard. Okay. Like if that's going to be the barrier to things, we're getting nothing done.
Is it usually hard to go to sleep? So for me, I have no issue falling asleep, but then I wake up 7 hours pretty much on a dot. I wake up and then I never really go back to sleep. So in my scenario, I get up and 7 seems to be a good number for me and it's predictable and on schedule. But if I stayed in bed or if I really wanted to get 9, would I be able to train myself using, to your point, sort of darker room and maybe some different practices with regards to devices or even what I'm eating before I go to sleep? Like, can you train yourself to sleep longer?
Would have to do a full assessment. Yeah, I'd have to do a full assessment and see. But for most of my athletes, when they say this is just the way it is, I do look at a whole bunch of things.
Yeah.
For example, like I can't tell you how many told me about all of a sudden we're going through and they're not sleeping. And then I find out that they got a dog and the dog is waking them up every morning. And they're like, oh, well, but that's not an option. I'm not letting the dog, the dog has to sleep with me. I'm like, well, look, you got to make a choice. For some people, I know It's a matter
My
of
dog's in the crate, by the way, so that's not a problem for me. She's crated.
So for some people, it's a thermostat because we know that it's cooler. So some people kind of I've had this with a couple of athletes where the temperature in their house starts to go up in the morning because they're starting to warm it for kids going to school, but it's that temperature rise that's waking them up. And so, there could be any number of things that it is. And it could be, I want to respect too, that you do well with 7 hours. And look, you don't want to set a world record. And so 7 hours works, because if you are going to sleep 2 more hours, well, that's going to take 2 more hours out of something else. So you get to make the choice, JM, about, well, is the benefit worth it?
Do you tell somebody to get up though? So like just a more general example, somebody tells you 7 hours, it's the first time they wake up. Do you tell them go off of the natural wake, or do you encourage them to try to force that additional time if you've decided that more time is better? Just curious.
Yeah, I would need more information to give an honest opinion, because again, I would say, well, in service of what? Like if you're getting up after 7 and you're sluggish all day and you're tired, then by all means we'd be finding ways to enhance the sleep. But if you're getting up after 7, you're like, and I'm fully refreshed and have a great day at work, then I'd be like, well, then maybe we should be working on something else before we think that that's where you're going to get the maximum benefit of our work together.
Nice. Yeah, that's a good answer. That makes sense.
So I've got an interesting twist on that. Between me and JM and Carrie, I think we have a total of 8 kids under the age of 10 in this call. I've got 4 of them on my own. So I think I'm a lost cause when it comes to sleeping 8 hours. I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon. But one thing that I think we can map it back to our audience about, and again, no judgment here, but how much does alcohol, even in light amounts, how much can that wreck your sleep?
Yeah. In short, very much. And even if, and it may knock you out, and people will say, oh, I drink to help me sleep. And I'm like, well, being unconscious is not the same as sleeping. And to get into the science of it more, is what it's preventing is for you from getting into the stage 4 deep sleep. And that's where a lot of the restoration occurs. So you might feel like you're knocked out, but for everybody that's ever drank and you slept a whole bunch, you do not wake up refreshed. And that's because you stay in the really light stages of sleep. And it's just a chemical thing. I mean, it's not a moral judgment. It's just, there's no way to beat it. Like, that's just what happens when you have alcohol in your system. It's just a fact.
Wow, that was our viral clip right there, Dr. Eddie. We want to be mindful of your time, but before we let you go, not all of our listeners are athletic or involved in sports. How would you say, some of the principles of sports psychology could be relevant to someone who's just kind of a everyday person? They don't really work out. Like, is there any way that someone can take this and apply it to their day-to-day life?
Yeah, 100%. Let me tell you, I take these same principles and I've worked with women with fibromyalgia. I've used these principles helping people overcome obesity, chronic pain. I've worked with a lot of health populations, and they love this because you're still a performer. I don't care whether you can walk around the block. I don't care if you're 300 pounds. You're performing in life. And you're going to come up with the same types of issues that I'm talking about here with my athletes, like performance anxiety, because you're going to care about the outcome. You're going to care about the meeting you're going to, or your church activity, or you want that great relationship with your family. And you're going to have fear and doubt because you're a human being. So everything that I've said to you today, I don't care if you've ever played a game of basketball in your life. This all applies to you. And all those principles about having a purpose, you have a purpose, and it may not be athletic. It could be musical. It could be spiritual. But you have something that you want to get done. And whatever it is that you want to get done, I know you've got challenges. I know it's hard. Excellence in any area is difficult. So everything that I have said, wherever you want to apply it, I promise you, the context will be different, but the principles are the same.
You hear that, Fuzzy Nation? You're performing at life. So keep that in mind and think about Dr. Eddie.
That's awesome. Dr. Eddie, before we let you go, it's kind of a weird question. We'll just kind of throw it out there, but you've been on a lot of podcasts. You've written some books. You work with a lot of very athletic people. Is there a question that you wish more people would ask that can help with their overall performance? Is there something that you just wish more people would ask you that you'd like to share before we close things up?
Let me think about that for a second. Something I wish they would ask. Well, as you might have guessed, I don't really give them the chance. If they don't ask, I tell them anyway. But I will really double down on, maybe I'll twist the question and say, what do I want you to most remember from this podcast?
Yeah.
And it would be these two principles. The one of to hold your emotions more lightly. We're wired to really care about them and respond. But if you can just kind of de-emphasize them and hold your character and your principles up higher and how you feel less with that willingness idea, that's going to give you a lot of progress. And the other one is, as you started us off, about don't get caught up in all this positive thinking stuff. Really create some room similar to the willingness, but hold on to the thoughts and feelings that you have, not as a description of your life, but as psychological experiences. They're so personal, and I want to respect that. They're so real. You know how people say perception is reality? I hate that. Perception is not reality. Reality is reality. So there's another cliche that's actually the book I'm going to write about sport cliches and how to fix them.
Perception is not reality. I love that.
It is not.
Yeah,
but when we
it's
kind of
your
say
book,
that,
too.
we become really constricted, because then what I think when I think that person's acting that way for that reason, now I've told myself a story and I'm going to act as if that were true, and I could ruin my life as a result of it. So start to be able to observe what you're thinking and feeling and see them as experiences. Remember that you've got the negativity bias, that idea that our mind is going to go out and try to warn us of danger. We've got all these things that kind of work against our performance. So we want to take a little bit more cautiously and step outside and practice that observing of what I'm thinking and feeling. And when it's not working, just let it be there and act in a way that does move us towards what we want.
I love it, dude. Man.
Yeah, I needed to hear that.
Yeah,
was
it's
solid.
awesome. Really
Yeah,
solid.
thank you, Dr. Eddie, for that. So for our listeners who are, just interested in exploring more about your work, peak performance, sports psychology, where's the best place for them to reach you and to connect with your content?
Oh, yeah, thanks for that. So really head over to my website, dreddieoconnor.com, and I've got a couple links for you there. If you want to get some more quick videos, I got a mental toughness in 60 seconds video series on YouTube, so you can get the link there, some nice quick tips. I've got them broken up according to subject areas. I really want to push the success stories community. So again, don't want you to think that only athletes are in there. I've got, the everyday people. I've got athletes in there too, but it's the community that if you do the course and you want to get all those principles, it's in this success stories community where I can support you to actually implement them. So as much as I'd love for you to binge the 12 hours of information, one of the metaphors or sayings that I have in the membership is knowledge without action is worthless. So I don't care if you got it all up here. If you don't do anything with it, it's not worth a damn. How do you start to execute these strategies? And so I would love to walk alongside you in the Success Stories community, just a link to the community there, and be able to walk with you and say, okay, what's this 1 or 2 principles, and start having you live that life that you want. You can get it, and I want to be there for you.
It's fantastic.
Dr. Eddie, it's truly been a pleasure having you on. Glad we were finally able to make this happen. Fuzzy Nation, I'm not sure if that's what we're calling our fans, but make sure you go ahead and follow Dr. Eddie. Go to his social links. We'll also
Give
have
him a
something in the
follow.
show notes.
We're talking sports, so everything is a nation in sports. So,
All right, boys.
we'll see you
Have a
later.
good one.
All right.
Take care.